Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Speaking Legally, where the legal meets the cultural. We're excited that you continue to join in each and every week, 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and you're a part of our dialogue, our discussion with our expert attorneys that are here to really give us the inside understanding of what's happening in the media, in the news, with everything that we're seeing transpire, and how you can arm yourself with the information that you need prior to any situations happening in your life. So I am joined by one of our expert attorneys today, Royce Russell Esquire. Edward Pichardo Esquire is on the road today. So, sometimes we're doing work off camera and on camera, but today we have an exciting show. We're going to really make this a tribute to Black history. We know it's the shortest month of the year, and every day is a day to talk about Black history, but there are some icons who paved the way when we think about the legal meeting the cultural. But make sure you know that next week we have a lot to catch up on.
The next couple of weeks, right?
We have cannabis legal in NJ. We have that Daniel Prude situation, what happened with him. The courts are reopening without a vaccination plan. And we're going to circle back on some of the employment issues that we talked about in the previous shows. So welcome, Richard. You ready? Love it. Hey, Kevin. Thank you for tuning in. So over to you, Mr. Russell, to greet everyone before we jump into our tribute today.
Well, for those that are first-time listeners and viewers, my name is Royce Russell. I am an attorney and counselor at law, and I underscore counselor because that's what attorneys do. We counsel you on the law. So hopefully together we can make the right decisions. I'm the author of a book called Cardiac Arrest, How to Handle Unlawful Police Stops. I specialize in civil rights, criminal defense, immigration, and ADR, which is Alternative Dispute Resolutions with the EEOC, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, as well as with FINRA, the Financial Institute for Dispute Resolution, and always opening my arms to the Eastern District of New York, sitting as an arbitrator and a mediator, resolving issues around 1983 civil rights violations, which is violations of the civil rights pertaining to police detentions, false arrests, excessive force, and wrongful death. And I say all that to say this, that every now and then we have to remind our viewers and listeners that everyone has a right to their opinion. It is those that have experience in various backgrounds are the opinions that you should listen to and hold between your two ears. I'm not saying you have to agree, but at least hold it for a minute before you take what you want to take and shake what you want to shake. And as you stated before, Dr. Grant, this is our second season. We're running strong and running long, and we're going to get to cannabis. We're going to get to the courts opening. We're going to get to employment again. We're going to get to 9/11 compensation board. What does that all mean? Immigration. What does family court look like? Up and onward, as we say. And you're right. This is one of the shortest months of the year. However, every day is Black History Day, as we know. And I just want to give a little homage to some folks that are lawyers, that are notable, but yet we do not know exactly how they got to where they got and some of the other things they have done that's outside of their notoriety. So thank you, everyone, for showing up and tuning in.
Yes, and Kevin said that he worked in EEOC for 15 years. You mediated workplace issues. So shout out to you. Clearly, Mr. Russell was going through all of his professional rap sheet. I don't know when he sleeps with all these things that he does, but appreciate the fact that he is advocating for those who don't have a voice and need someone to litigate on their behalf in a variety of ways. So let's get into this whole discussion of, from the legal standpoint, there are some that we can pay tribute to, many whose names never made it to the media or to the reference library of individuals understanding how many powerful individuals paved the way for Mr. Russell or Mr. Pichardo to actually practice in the field of law and give their expertise to the world. So we're going to highlight a few that Mr. Russell particularly has just a fond reaction to what the work they have achieved. And in addition to that, I so love the fact that media can change The narrative can create opportunities for education and can allow us to learn more about what has happened within our culture. And of course, during this month, everyone is highlighting that. So I want to shout out all of the executive producers of Amend. It is a Netflix series.
Wow. Yes.
Yes, it is amazing. Will Smith is one of the executive producers and narrators throughout the show. It's a compilation of different stars that you'll recognize. And I love the fact that it's a variety of age groups that are represented in this. I think it's about a 6 or 7 part series. Incredible. I want to shout out Skip Gates, that we know has been telling our stories for years. And he did a 2 part series on the Black church. So we're going to touch on some of what came up out of both of those, but we're going to start first with just honoring those giants in the legal industry that, when I say industry, the legal profession, that have really paved the way for what we see happening now. And actually, some of them were referenced in these shows. So let's kick it over to you, Mr. Russell. You have something to say about these individuals that we are viewing on the screen.
Yes, you're looking at Thurgood Marshall, you're looking at Barbara Jordan, you look at Eunice Carter. Some of the names you've heard before, but we're going to discuss some of the things that you may not know about these giants. As we all know, Thurgood Marshall was the first African-American Supreme Court justice brought on in 1967. I want you to pin that year, 1967, because that's an important year, and I'll quiz Dr. Grant on that in 5 seconds, all right? And, Thurgood Marshall was born July 2nd, 2008. He was the founder of the Legal Defense Fund. That's the NAACP, Legal Defense Fund. And he was the first director of counsel. So, Dr. Grant, what is significant about 1967 as it relates to you and I?
I don't know. Suddenly my brain is foggy.
Oh, it's a year after 1966. And I'm not going to tell which one of us was born in 1966. Okay?
Noticeable.
All right, then. And then what is so important about the fact that his birthday is July 2nd,
The day after
1908?
born. Oh, my goodness.
The day what? I can't hear you.
The day after a certain attorney on this show was born.
July 1st situation. There was a July 2nd sighting. So, men that hang together, we bang together. We bang the gavel. We bang the court system. We shake it up. We root it out. So I just want to see, that's one of those tidbits that a lot of people didn't know. And I want to put it in the forefront. We know Thurgood Marshall for being the leader in reference to the Brown versus Board of Education litigation in 1994, which was a class action. I think it appears to be something with our audio going on. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. Class action, which ended segregation in public schools. And that's what we know him for. But before the Board of Education, Thurgood Marshall was in private practice. And in private practice before the class action. So let me define what class action is. That's when a group of people sue for a particular violation, not just one person, but a group. So many people signed on to be part of this class for which he brought this lawsuit, right? But before Brown versus Board of Education, Thurgood Marshall cut his teeth on criminal defense work, out there, hitting it, having the fortitude to represent the voiceless and the accused. And here are some of the cases that that most people don't know about, but he was the lead counsel. And so where did he cut his teeth? As I said, criminal defense. And we look at Chambers v. Florida. I'm looking over to the left or to your right because I want to make sure that I fact check and nobody can say that I misspoke. Now, Chambers v. Florida, that was a case that presided before the court in 1940. And that's where 4 black males were indicted and on trial for murder. And Brother Marshall, the esteemed Justice Marshall, was able to have those statements that these 4 black males made that were coerced by the police, similar to Central Park 5, statements that were beaten out of the accused, that led to their conviction, those statements were thrown out of court and they were acquitted. Once again, fighting for those that were voiceless in a paramount case that showed way back in 1940 how police will get you to make statements by way of force or by way of persuasion, knowing that you had nothing to do with the crime. Peyton v. Mississippi, another case, Marshall fought for. And that was a case where an African-American male was indicted for murder by an all-white grand jury, then went to trial and had all-white jurors for which he was convicted. Now, in the criminal field, we often hear the word Peyton violation. Peyton violation. What does it all mean? It means that the group was not representative of a jury of your peers. And in Mississippi at that time, there was approximately, and let me look at my notes to make sure I have it right, there was approximately 12,511 blacks in a county for which housed a county which was made up of 34,821 people. And 25 African Americans were qualified to sit as jurors and to sit in the grand jury for which they were not selected. So Brother Marshall fought to have the indictment squashed, to have the proceedings thrown out. And what is squash? Basically is to have the court preclude the indictment, preclude the proceedings. And his basis was that the young man's name was Peyton, but it was patently obvious that the jury was skewed and racist, and it was not a jury of that individual's peers, and that there was a pattern in practice for there to be white jurors on a case that where there were blacks that were available in the masses ready to serve. And I always find that interesting because having practiced in federal court and having been faced with mostly white jurors in federal court, I often wonder, where do the black people go when it comes down to federal court? Now, for our listeners, there is state court. You have a case, it happens in the Bronx, it happens at Bronx Criminal Court or Bronx Civil Court, Bronx Supreme Court. Same thing in Manhattan. Then you have federal court, which has a broader jurisdiction, and in Manhattan, that takes up Manhattan, that takes up Westchester, that takes up northern part of the city, Mount Vernon, and for Brooklyn, Queens, and Long Island, that is the Eastern District. And I always wonder why, when it came down to jurors, you can rarely find black people that sit as jurors. So now, if I'm thinking about that now in 2021, just imagine in 1940, somewhere around about there, that this individual was faced with grand jurors made up of people that did not look like him and was basically indicted for murder by people that didn't look like him. That's outstanding. And imagine the pressure that Brother Marshall was under. And so let me just read a quote from that case. When you look at what happened, Peyton v. Mississippi really highlighted the systematic and purposeful exclusions of blacks, and it was in violation of the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment, in pertinent part, speaks to the equal protection under the law, the freedom to life and liberty, and protection under the law with due process. And so by there being an all-white jury that indicted this individual, the argument was that it was systematic and purposeful, and it was the exclusion of blacks, and it was in violation of his 14th Amendment, and hence it was squashed.
So it's interesting as you're talking about this. I'm thinking about the show of Men, who actually highlights that period of time when we were into the Jim Crow era, and talking about all of the injustices that we were seeing and how Thurgood Marshall really grew out of Howard University law. Howard University law being run by us, that he wasn't going to be accepted in other spaces to get this degree. And he wanted to use education and the law to be a part of the fight for equality, and why he had all of these cases before he eventually made it to the Supreme Court. He really, as you said, he dug his teeth in. He was like, we're going to fight this and we're going to use the law to our advantage. And so he kept collecting these wins along the way, utilizing the 14th Amendment, which is really what the whole series is based on, the different aspects and all of what came out of defending, not defending, changing, not changing, what the meaning of the 14th Amendment really is for our country. So I found it interesting that, as they highlighted his story and they talked about the different ways that our leaders have advocated for justice, that he took this path and he wanted to not only learn how to litigate, he wanted to use this as one of the weapons and the tools that could advocate for African Americans in this country.
And let me just say, that's only like the tip of what he has done. So I'm going to go through some other cases because I think is noteworthy. And like I said, Brown v. Board of Education is what we tip our hat off to him. But there's other cases that he transitioned from the criminal side to the civil side. And the fact that he's a graduate of Howard Law School and really made it a point to have within his career fighting those and fighting against institutions that would not allow us at their universities and colleges. And so Murray v. Pearson is another case where now we look at him as an icon and we wonder, was he just a child prodigy? And I would say no, everyone has a mentor. And his mentor was Charles Houston. And he worked with Charles Houston in the case of Murray v. Pearson, where they fought for Donald Murray, who was academically eligible, but was denied admission to University of Maryland Law School back in 1936.
Mm.
Now, in that case, he was able to peel back and unearth what we call de jure racial segregation. De jure, D-E-J-E-R-E, racial segregation versus de facto segregation. Now, you may have heard me use this term, or you might have read it in Cardiac Arrest. We talk about de facto quotas. So let me define what we mean by de facto. That means it is not on the books. It is not law, but it happens. It is almost as good as law. It is something that's voluntary, but yet is mandatory at the same time. So it is de facto. It plays itself out in life. And so there may not be a law that said whites and blacks can't eat together. However, the restaurant plays that out. Now, that versus de jure racial segregation. That is segregation that's codified in a law. It says blacks only, whites only. Blacks can only drink at certain areas. That is codified in state or in legislation, which goes back to what you were talking about, Dr. Grant, Jim Crow laws, right? Where blacks and whites were separated. Now, the Jim Crow era, we always think of different transportation. We always think of different housing. But one of the things that the Jim Crow laws affected, which I learned, and it was a data point of awakening for me in reviewing Thurgood Marshall, was that there was Jim Crow laws in reference to prisons, in reference to the bad guys. You had black jails and you had white jails. I never thought about that. Then on top of that, there were Jim Crow laws in reference to cemeteries. Now, that one really shook the boots. You know what I'm saying? We're down in the earth, going back up to our spirituality, and you're telling me that black folks and white folks cannot be buried in the same plot. Slave owners and slaves cannot be buried in the same plot. They cannot be housed for rehabilitation by way of prisons. They have separate prisons. And so that was what we call de jure segregation. And by Jim Crow laws, and we know that de facto segregation still exists to this day. Redlining in certain industries, certain cities being polarized and divided. And so we see that playing out throughout America. So that's Murray v. Pearson. One other case I want to mention is Smith v. Allwright. Now, this will shake your boots, and wherever Ed is on location, I'm sure if he hears this, the sound of my voice will have him shaking and quivering. Smith v. Allwright, 1944 case, where the court struck down, and Marshall played a role in fighting that case. The court struck down the Democratic Party, quote, 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 Democratic Party, use of all white people only primary elections in various southern states. So if you were black, you could not participate in the primary. They only use white folks. And so this is a little moment where we can talk a little bit, Dr. Grant. You know, people rarely look at where you're from, they look at where you're at. And where we're at now, when it comes down to parties that most people of color think represent us and have our best interests, we look at the Democratic Party. And we need to look at history, because history will show you that whether Republican or Democrat, it's like wearing a pair of flip-flops, disposable and or reusable. The Democrats weren't always in our corner. Republicans were. And over time, that evolved and flipped. And as Lincoln called Frederick Douglass into his office and told him, from the shows that we've seen, that you cited, that blacks and whites will never be equal, my man, but we need your help, or else you'll never be able to own your 40 acres and mules, right?
It's you know, one of the things as you were talking, it was bringing back up pieces of Amend, because it is such a rich, well done documentary. I've seen so many documentaries over the years that have highlighted our experience throughout the Richard said Democrats used to Republicans. Look, Richard, that's a question I'll let Mr. Russell answer. I'm not sure about that, but I will say our history throughout the diaspora has been shown through different lenses. And when we are the ones doing the research and sharing the narrative, everything from Roots to Eyes on the Prize to the current ones that we're talking about today, it gives pause to really understand the importance of critical thinking, do your own reading and research of what it is that you are ingesting. What are you receiving? Like, are you familiar with Before the Mayflower, When and Where I Enter? There's so many things that we as a community are not aware of, because if we put it in a book or someone has done that research and we are not reading and opening that up to our children and our children's children, it's like you miss the opportunity for the history lesson to be told. So that's why I'm really excited about Amend, because it doesn't cover everything. It's not exhaustive, but it does go into particularly the lens of seeing our experience with the 14th Amendment and everything that has come out of that. So I say all that to say, I saw some real through lines to our recent disaster that we've witnessed in these United States when it comes to lies being told and drilling down on negative theories in the market and on media. I'm looking at some of the things that came up with Brown versus Board of Education, and even in, Prince Edward County, Virginia, was so upset about the prospect of integrating their school. They shut down the public schools for 5 years. Like, that's how inbred this whole, it's crazy. Like, the racism that exists at the core of this country, it baffles your mind to think that normally educated individuals would make such decisions. Like, that's how angry they were. And that people like George Wallace, the playbook that was used then, we saw that playbook again. Oh, we're not going to follow this illegal, mandate from the government. We're not going to follow this. I'm like, wow. history repeating itself over and over again because we don't learn the lessons that need to be learned and really have the overhaul that needs to happen on our justice system. This is where the legal meets the cultural. Some of the things that are highlighted and that we're continuing to amplify, it's not new. It's just packaged in a different way. And these are the conversations that we need our children to be aware of because it's always the young people that move the revolution forward. And that's why we see so many coming together right now. Like, nah, that was your generation. We're not doing it that way. We have voices that need to be heard. So the conversations have to happen. We give our counsel. We create some healthy advice as far as boundaries, but we're not going to stifle their mouths. Martin Luther King was 26. Rosa Parks, nobody was past 40 in the movement. I would dare say past 30, that really moved and transitioned us through all the different experiences that we had from emancipation to civil rights to where we are now. So it's just, as you were talking, it was bringing that up for me, Mr. Russell, and I so appreciate what Thurgood Marshall, Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, did, because he took what you say all the time. Everybody's not going to be protesting. Everybody's not going to be doing the petitions. Somebody has to be able to litigate these cases with the weapon that we have, with utilizing the instrument of law the way it should be. So I just wanted to add to the system.
I want to cite two more cases before we move on. Democrats used to be Republicans. Is that true? Yes. Yeah. No, Democrats used to be Democrats and Republicans used to be Republicans, but their interests were flip-flopped. So there was no changing of names, and I know what you're saying, but the agenda was different back in the 1846, in the 1836, things of that nature. It was totally different. Blacks became Democrats during the FDR administration. That's part of the reason men had the first name of Roosevelt. I don't doubt you, Brother Kevin, because you're a historian of all historians. So to speak to what you said in reference to Virginia closing down the public schools, Thurgood Marshall also had his hand in Plessy v. Ferguson. You always hear about Plessy v. Ferguson, Plessy v. Ferguson. And what it really stood for was the argument that separate will never mean equal. Now, you know that Malcolm X was an advocate and Marcus Garvey was an advocate of separate but equal. Just let us do our own thing. And what Brother Marshall was able to feather out is that, yes, that idea is one that we should uphold, but understand that when we separate, it'll never be equal. And so that's what he argued in Plessy v. Ferguson. Separate but equal doesn't exist in theory. And so he went on to highlight all the shortcomings when it comes down to the education. And you can see how he stayed in the field of education and civil rights because of his background, that theory would not be a theory that can hold to light. He also went on to argue Morgan v. Virginia in 1946, which basically said that the Supreme Court ruled it illegal to have segregation when it comes down to interstate buses, transportation, commerce, and so that is travel among states. And what was interesting about that was that it said segregation, when it comes down to traveling among states, was in violation of the Commerce Clause. And so I've heard a lot about the Commerce Clause. And so if I'm using it, I need to define it. And so I will read what it says. The Commerce Clause is codified in the Constitution. It is a power granted by the Constitution that allows Congress to have power and regulate commerce with foreign nations and among several states and with Indian tribes. Now, ain't that something? So basically, the United States control everything at that point, right? We can control the Indians and what goes on, Native Americans, as far as that commerce is concerned. We control commerce among states and with other nations. And therefore, if there's segregation in the transportation of buses, trains, and the like, then that means that the court can strike that down. And we find it illegal. So that's an interesting tidbit when it comes down to Thurgood Marshall and the heights that he went to in fighting in sticking up for us. It's amazing, and he doesn't stand alone. Let me just do my clipboard here. Excuse that. That we also know that Barbara Jordan and Eunice Carter, as you see here, were also revolutionary attorneys. Attorneys. But let me put a pin in that, and let me say that now, as you spoke of, Dr. Grant, young folks, they don't have to have a JD, a Juris Doctorate. They don't have to be an attorney. Um, and they don't necessarily have to get in what we call good trouble, because they could put pen to paper and participate in good trouble and be advocate and rebel rousers. They could be all in one, and social media influencers. They can do all of that. But what I'm seeing also, whether you say LeBron or whether you say Colin Kaepernick or Eric Reed, and you name those NFL players that kneeled and stood for something when it came down to police brutality and social injustice and criminal injustice, that march is still going on, and is going on in ways that are not, quote unquote, so dramatic. Here's a case in point. You look at Deshaun Watson, quarterback for the Houston Texans, right?
Mhm.
Great quarterback, world renowned, should have probably got the MVP. He doesn't want to play for the Houston Titans anymore. I mean, excuse me, the Houston Texans. He don't want to play for them anymore. He said, I had enough playing for them. Their ownership allegedly is racist, doesn't understand social justice. He asked, as the franchise quarterback, I'm the guy. Everybody, so you understand football. Quarterback is the guy. You can have anything you want, but if you don't have a quarterback, you're not going to win. Hence Tom Brady. Hence my man Patrick Mahomes. Hence Rodgers. These are quarterbacks that if you don't have them, you're not winning. I don't care what you say. You need them. Lamar Jackson. You need these guys. And so he has said that if you want to keep me, why don't you interview Eric Bieniemy, right? And that's an African American head offensive coordinator for the Kansas City Chiefs, for which they won a Super Bowl with, for which Patrick Mahomes has done wonderful things with. Why don't you interview him as a candidate for the new coaching position? Did ownership listen? No. He said, why don't you interview some of these other GMs that are of color for the open general manager position? Did ownership listen? No, they ignored it. So Deshaun Watson said, you know what? I had enough. I want out. I'm not playing this year. You're not connecting the dots of social injustice and my value here. And quite frankly, Watson holds the trump card. He could not play this year. He has a no trade clause in his contract. That means if you don't trade me to a certain venue, I could say no, I don't want to go. And we're going to see how this plays out, because he is quietly leveraging the social injustices and criminal injustices and the plight of people of color in the arena of sports as a black quarterback, franchise quarterback, well respected Super Bowl kind of quarterback, MVP quarterback. And what does he say? He says, I want to go to a team like Miami Dolphins. I like their culture. And you say, well, why is that relevant in this whole conversation of being involved and being in the movement, not the moment? Well, Miami Dolphin has a black GM, Christopher Greer, has a black coach, Brian Flores from Brownsville, Brooklyn, right? And when you look at how many black head coaches are in the NFL, and the NFL stands for the National Football League, but it also stands for, when it comes down to black folks, the people of power, not for long, right? You get the power and then not for long, you fired, right? We only have 4 black head coaches. You have Michael Tomlin, Pittsburgh Steelers, Brian Flores, which I mentioned, Miami Dolphins, Ron Rivera, which is the Washington football team, and Robert Saleh, which the Jets just hired. When you look at black general managers, you have Chris Greer, Miami Dolphins. You have Martin Mayhew, Washington football team. You have Andrew Berry, Cleveland Browns. You have Terry Fontenette, Atlanta Falcons, and then you have Brad Holmes, Detroit Lions. So in total, you have 9 people of color in positions of power. And when you look at the Tampa Bay Super Bowl Buccaneers, all of their coaches outside of the head coach, Bruce Arians, who had a second bite at the apple, when you say not for long league, who failed before and should have been fired, and who is the oldest, one of the oldest NFL coaches around, if not the oldest, all of his staff, in reference to offensive line coach, in reference to offensive coordinator, in reference to defensive line coach, defense coordinator, special teams, are all African Americans.
Well, hope springs eternal. That we continue to see these examples of those who are really not just talking about what reform looks like, what racial equity looks like, they're actually putting it in action. So shout out to them. And we know that work began with our dear Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall and what he was able to really just start and put in place, and that can still be referenced to this day. And I'm glad that we have our two sisters to highlight as attorneys as well that have done amazing work within the area of law for us, and truly have opened up space for some of the other great female attorneys, African American women, that have come since then. And we know we currently have a Black woman attorney in the Vice President office of these United States, Kamala Harris, and we know Shirley Chisholm had to do the work that she did in order for there to be a VP Harris. So let's get into our dear sisters as we continue this Black History tribute for our show today.
So we look at Eunice Carter, and Eunice Carter is dear to my heart because she was the first Black female prosecutor in New York County. The first. That's amazing. Like, I never thought about New York County and how colorless it could be. I look at their colorless in its practice, but not implementation. And she was the first. Now, she was born July 16th, 1899. Now, what is important about July 16th, 1899? I mean, like, I'm just saying, they say when you get cancer, you want to fight, but they need to reverse it. Cancers are fighters. You know what I mean? I think they just really need to reverse that connotation and make it something more pleasurable. But she stood in the forefront. She led the Pan-African Congress to advance the status of women in the world. She founded the Black division of the YMCA. So this is outside of law. She's the first Black woman to receive a law degree from, guess what? Fordham University. Isn't that something, right? That's a little local tidbit. Mm-hmm. And what she is known for is prosecuting and convicting Lucky Luciano, the famous mobster who eluded prison time for a very long time. And here, Eunice Carter came in and attached him to a prostitution room for which he had to serve 10 years. And then Lucky wasn't so unlucky because after he served his 10 years, he was deported. So wow. You want to talk about immigrants and you want to talk about, illegal conduct. You want to talk about, Trump tried to make it like as if, all immigrants do bad things. People do bad things. And it didn't start when he ran for president, and it goes on for life. That's it, And that mobster was here forever, working with immunity, just around. And she was the first to not only serve as a prosecutor, but convict him. And that was a big deal, if you can imagine, way back when. That was no small feat for her to do that.
Absolutely. And I love the fact that she was the first. You just have to have one person that breaks through something that wasn't done, and it opens up the opportunity for everybody else to see that it's possible. And that's why it's important, although we know Black history is 365 days 24/7, it's important to utilize the space and time that everyone is giving the attention to our contributions so that we can educate those who don't know and inspire our own young people to know what's possible because of those who came before. So thank you for sharing that. And I did not realize she was July 16th. Lord have mercy. Don't tell me that Barbara Jordan was born in July too.
Well, no, I didn't want to override you guys and show that I had a patent and practice to pick people that happen to be cancers. I wouldn't do that to you guys. And so I'm not going to reveal her date of birth. But if you want to look it up and you come to find out that it's in a summertime month, that's on you. But I won't disperse that on you. So Barbara Jordan, she led the House Judiciary Committee against Richard Nixon. Now we talk about impeachment, right? And we watched Stacey Plaskett, right, give her speech and how wonderful she was dressed. Well, she was stepping in Barbara Jordan's shoes because Barbara Jordan, opened the House impeachment process, giving her speech as to why Nixon should be impeached. And we know what happened to Nixon. He resigned before actually being impeached. Now, ain't that something? I wonder if it was because Barbara turned on the flames. And as they say in one of my Black exploitation films, I think the woman said Roosevelt, the president said it, if it's too hot in the kitchen, get out. You know what I mean? Did she turn up the flames to have him think about what his future would be? She was the first African-American woman to deliver a keynote address at the 1976 Democratic National Convention. In the 1960s, she was in private practice. She won a Senate seat in 1966. Very, very good year, 1966. And you must know how hard it must have been for her to do that when she won a Senate seat in Texas. Can you imagine what it was like?
Well, after you finish highlighting her, we're going to talk about some of these shows which talk about particularly that state of Texas and what was going on all over the South. But I don't know. Mr. Russell, I don't think I would have survived because my mouth would have gotten me in a whole lot of trouble.
You know what I mean? One other thing that she did, and then we could talk about those shows that are showing some of this and highlight some of this. In 1972, she was the only African-American woman, and I think she might have been the only Black woman so far that served as the governor of Texas. And she only served for one day, but she served nonetheless. Now, let me tell you something about Barbara Jordan. She was about the business. And if you look at her record when it came down to immigration, she was hard on immigrants because in that time and era, America has done enough and they needed to close the gates. They need to do something different. A lot of people don't realize when Obama was the president, his immigration laws were quite strict, and he focused on those that were already issued deportation orders to make sure that they left the United States. And Barbara Jordan, she served on the Commission for Immigration. She was the first African-American woman to deliver the keynote address at the Democratic National Convention, as I stated, again in the 90s. And, my hat off to her because she was about her business.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And we appreciate what all three of these attorneys represented. Of course, this is not a full list. We have many more, but three that were highlighted today that hopefully will inspire the next generation that come even after Mr. Pichardo and Mr. Russell, right? That this is what we want for the future to know that this is one avenue that you can choose to advocate for the rights, the unalienable rights of who we are as a people. And I'll start first with one of the shows that I mentioned, The Black Church. And this is one of the historians that I particularly am very fond of. Mr. Henry Louis Gates Jr., Skip Gates, as he's affectionately called, because he has really chronicled and documented so many parts of our history. And he said in the beginning of this that he realized this was one story that hadn't really been told. And he really goes through just how important the crossroads of advocacy and the Black church really played in all of the movements that we've seen. And I'm not sure if this trailer will play, but let's see if we can. We'll try it in a minute. But if you haven't seen it, take a look at it. I don't know what your religious orientation is, and it really doesn't matter in viewing it, because they really do a good job in just going over how the Black church was the place where people were educated. It was this church that started the schools, some of our first HBCUs that came out of church, where the political movements happened because the preachers were merging the gospel and advocacy, what needed to be done. That was the place that people went to get information on what was happening, where the next protest would be taking place, where the next issue would be addressed, and all of that starting in the Black church. And then some of the struggles of the Black church's history and experience, and just religion in and of itself, what was stripped from our African brothers and sisters that were stolen from the motherland and brought here, and what that looked like with Christianity and Muslim practices that were found inside churches. So it really is a series that I would invite you to take a look at. It's on PBS, which is a local station for those who are in New York, Channel 13. But if you're not in New York, you can still go to the website and you can view it on the app. Most people have these smartphones that you can download apps. You can download the PBS app and be able to see both parts of this series. And if you have children, I would watch it with your children. There's some great speaking points that are in here about the struggle that some people have had with acknowledgement of what their faith practice is, how they show up in the world, how this has impacted what we believe and who we are as a people. So congratulations once again to our dear brother, Henry Louis Gates Jr., for doing such an amazing job in bringing yet one more story, one more detailed experience, and just really walking through what the Black church has represented in our culture.
You know, what's interesting about this is that the church was also used to our demise, right? As African Americans coming over from Africa, white folks at that time tried to force feed that the Bible would have us, religion would have us in this space and place in time, and that anything outside of that was going against God. And it is amazing to watch and have an understanding how, and this is my perspective, everybody doesn't have to accept this, that the book of the Bible, written by a person, so that means a person has biases, a person has some sort of jadedness, and watching how parables to tell a story, to illustrate how one should live their life, understanding of spirituality has been used over time for ill will. And how that has evolved to the spirituality and the Bible and preaching for power and empowerment, as well as understanding politics and understanding who we should put our vote for and against and up, in reference to, we all hear the story, the brown bag going to the pastor, right? That just shows you the influence that the church has had in the Black community and community of color that can determine who wins and who loses, what laws get passed and what laws don't. And so Skip Gates, who's been a victim of false arrest when he tried to enter his own home and someone called the police, and, you know, they questioned him as whether or not he lived there, and they were about to arrest him. And it was proven that he lived there, all to get nothing but an apology. I wonder what happened with that case. But here we are, him telling the story.
Absolutely. And we need to circle back with Skip so he can know about cardiac arrest, and he can share that with his family and those in the community, because even given who he is as a Harvard professor, that didn't mean anything to the officers because all they saw was black skin. And what I like about the fact that this particular documentary that he did, it speaks directly to what you mentioned. You know, what was changed, what was left out when the slave owners were giving this information about religion to slaves. So everyone has their beliefs, but I believe God has a plan for everything. And even in that, we were still smart enough, still strong enough to understand who we were and our value, and why there was such a block on trying to keep us from reading, keep us from remembering who we were as a people and what cultures we came with. And I thought it was really interesting in the series. I'm trying to remember where the church was. I believe in South Carolina, where they found traces of some Muslim writing, which are engraved in the pews in a Christian church. And they did the research and understanding some of what was brought over and that were kept by oral tradition being passed down to the next generation. Like we saw some of the traditions that from the Roots series, that we witnessed what it looked like to orally tell our story. So it really goes through a great deal of tact in addressing all the challenges to the church, addressing the grounding in the church, addressing the social issues that the church didn't want to touch and was under criticism for. So it's definitely one documentary that I would recommend during not only Black History Month, at any time, to really take a look at what he put together. And he had a nice, I would say, mix of religious backgrounds in the Black church, talking about AME churches to Baptist churches to Pentecostal churches, just how within our Black church experience, there are other divisions and challenges that come up. So I thought it was pretty courageous for him to address the Black church history in this way. And it's worth looking at. And to your point, Mr. Russell, everyone's not going to agree with everything, but I think we should always open up our minds to be able to look at another perspective, to see things through different paradigms, so we can really educate ourselves on what we are experiencing in our community. And it's directly related to a story that was highlighted in Amend. But I want you to just share your last thoughts on this before we switch to that show.
Well, as I said, I think it's powerful. I think that anybody that sits down and analyze and look at the church, we know that the church has provided a safe haven for slaves and during the time of slavery. I remember just seeing the other day a piece about how Detroit and Michigan played a major role in harboring those that were going through the Underground Railroad, and the church was a major factor, where they had rooms underneath and caves underneath certain areas of the church. So the church will forever be embedded in our history, both from a freedom fighter perspective, from a political perspective. We just got to hope that those pastors, those reverends, are in line with what is actually going on in the world when it comes down to people of color, versus either lining the pocket or having some other interest, like building a child care facility, and that, if I vote the right way or vote this way, this can happen.
To be continued, right? Because that's an ongoing discussion. But to your point, we hope that the lessons that are shared in that particular chronicling of the Black church can lead us to a place where we can be some of what we've lost, I think. But that's a whole nother conversation. And that's saying that as the chief faithpreneur, right? So there's no secret what my faith is and grounding, but there are conversations, and sometimes tough conversations, that need to happen. So this series that we're highlighting is Amend. This is on Netflix for those of you who have the capacity to view a Netflix show. I highly recommend this as a watch. My husband and I were watching it, and I'm going to encourage my sons to watch it with us so that we can just talk through some of what Will Smith and all of the other narrators are lifting up. There was a lot of thought that was put into this, and I love the angle because we've heard some of the stories that are discussed through different shows and different documentaries, but this was specifically coming back to the 14th Amendment and talking about how this 14th Amendment came to be, the opposition to it, what that led to, and just seeing a different way of chronicling history, the way they laid it out. I think it was just really well done. And I'm talking about the church because part of the series focused on a view of what happened in the past and current day. And Reverend Clemente Pinckney, those of you that remember that horrific shooting that happened in the church, it was, I believe, 2015, when that young man walked in and shot and killed him and the other parishioners. Some of the backstory, a lot of people didn't know that Reverend Clemente was a senator, and he talked about just the ways in which we needed to wrestle with and reconcile the inequalities. And he actually, I think it was a month or two before he was killed, was a part of a huge conference, and it was with clergy. And the gentleman, I'm forgetting his name right now, which was a white man who was a part of this series. He said, I remember holding the program with him, and we were singing America the Beautiful together. He said, I've never been into a conference like that where it was just really highlighting the power of us working together and what it means if you have a faith practice, that if you believe in a God, that we all should be working together. And then to see that man gunned down so senselessly, it was another reminder of the role and the challenge when a church is vocal, because it also goes through all the church burnings that happened every time there was a meeting or an uprising or something to do about advocating for justice. As we talk about where the legal meets the cultural, it met in the Black church, and they were burnt down time and time again. And it really just highlights all of these. But it brings me to my last point on this. When he died and they had the funeral, people were coming. President Obama went and spoke at the funeral. It was a big piece of news. The American flag was lowered for the respect of what had happened, but the Confederate flag was still flying because of the law. So that's why I want to bring it back to what we talk about on this show, understanding what the real play is. Where is the playbook? Understanding we play chess, not checkers. The law of that state was that Confederate flag could not be brought down without the state capitol voting to make that happen. And that's where Bree Newsom, powerful sister, climbed that flagpole knowing that she was going to get arrested. And she said, this will come down today. I'm paraphrasing a whole lot more. And she brought that flag down and she was arrested, and it brought the attention back to the country on what was happening. The American flag of this country could be lowered, but the Confederate flag stood standing. She said no more. And that was another young voice, just like Rosa Parks said no more. Just like before Rosa Parks, there was Paul Murray, another attorney that was tired of the injustice.
And how old were these people at that time?
Bree Newsom had to be in her 20s. I don't know exactly how old.
That's right.
And Emily was definitely in her early or late 20s as well. And it's a name that we don't know because of a whole nother challenge of her lifestyle and how she identifies. So she didn't get as much play as Rosa Parks played in the civil rights movement. But it was 15 years before Rosa took that seat that Paulie did the same thing and continue to advocate for the rights. And because of Bree Newsom being so brave, that's when they were able to get in that particular state of South Carolina, that flag to come down. So advocacy is necessary. Knowing our history is imperative. reading for ourselves, doing our critical thinking, doing our research, and celebrating quality work like the Black Church and Amend can help us to educate the next generation so that they know that they're not crazy for feeling some kind of way about the injustices that we see, but that they can also know that didn't just happen out of the clear blue sky. They're standing on the shoulders of those who suffered so much more than we could ever comprehend. And we owe them a debt of thanks with our continued advocacy until we really can have the equality that we've been seeking for generations. So, Mr. Russell, over to you before we close out our Black History tribute today on Speaking Legally.
Look, you said it a mouthful, and you said enough. I would just suggest that folks also look at Judas and the Black Messiah, right? Which kind of goes through Fred Hampton and goes through, what the Black Panthers were all about. I think that's a good flick to look at. Just stay entrenched in your culture. I think it's important, and don't let February be the month that you only do that. And it's okay to look at some of the Black exploitation films to have an understanding what was happening in the 70s, what was happening in the 60s, and how we evolved as a race and as a people. So with that, I say, without further ado, I hope to see you again next week. Same time, same bad channel.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thanks again for tuning in.